But it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Anssi, who you're all familiar with, I assume. A little bit of background on Anssi. He's from Finland. He served in the Finnish military, achieved the rank of
Serving, actually.
Are you really? Technically, that's pretty good. It's pretty good.
You don't really have to do anything, but
Even better. It's the best kind of service. It's the best kind of service. Anssi did his undergrad in the United Kingdom at Loughborough University. He did his master's degree here in Minnesota at Minnesota State University, Mankato. And that's where I met Anssi a couple of years ago. And of course now he's in the PhD program in exercise physiology. So he'll be sharing essentially his proposal for his dissertation study that is about to be kicked off here in the next couple of weeks. So he'll share that with us. So thanks, Anssi. The floor is yours, bud.
all right. Thank you, Dr. Abel, and thanks everyone for coming. I know it's Friday morning, and there might be other things to do at this time. But yeah, I'll be sharing my dissertation proposal or dissertation project and background to it, methods, things like that. So we'll go through introduction and then purpose and aims, and then methods of how to go about conducting the research, and then we'll leave questions at the end. But if there's anything you want to ask during, just raise your hand and we'll address it. I'm sure we're not going to run out of time today. Hopefully, since I don't have a whole lot of data to show. Hopefully later. So yeah, any questions come up at any point, let me know. But yeah, just to go through introduction first and start with the scope of the issue. So there's about 1.2 million firefighters in the U.S. and 75% of them approximately are volunteer and 30% are career, and the issue I'll be addressing or hope to be addressing would concern both of those populations. So to start out with, there's plenty of research now indicating different predictors of occupational performance for firefighters. So these are just a couple of studies I'm pointing out, but for example, treadmill time, peak knee torque, knee flexion, just different endurance type measures and different strength type measures, and body composition measures have been related to occupational performance. And in a different study, poor performance was correlated with high resting heart rate, body composition measures, and also age, whereas better performance has been associated with abdominal strength, so different strength measures, and also strength endurance measures. So those are just a couple of studies to point out, but there's others that are out there. So in terms of training-related studies, so the study where Dr. Abel was also a part of, Denison et al., they showed that trained firefighters were faster than untrained firefighters in a simulated fireground test. And it was actually, they even reported that 16% of the untrained firefighters did not complete the simulated fireground test that they administered. And even when the firefighters were in a post-training fatigue state, most of them still outperformed the untrained firefighters, or the mean time was actually faster than 70% of the untrained firefighters. And then there's a study to show just a different training programs. So there's different resistance training programs. There's an undulating and linear periodization, and they both resulted after the training period into better physical performance. What the common denominator with these studies, these ones and these ones, that usually the performance has been measured in terms of time, how fast the firefighters can complete the occupational task, whereas in real life, it isn't necessarily always how fast they can perform those activities. It's also how much stress they place on themselves when they're going through their fireground tasks on duty. So I did find one study where they showed that in these different tasks shown in here, the heart rate values that occurred during those tasks correlated with their estimated maximal VO2 max or maximal aerobic capacity. And then in the bottom here, these are the worst performers in terms of VO2 max. They had the highest mean heart rate during that activity. But this was the only thing that I showed. But why we would want to look at heart rate or physical stress predictors in firefighters is because of the most common cause for death on duty for firefighters is heart attack. So just looking at the last 10 years, about 65 to 110 people, firefighters have died on duty, and then pretty consistently 40 to 50% of those die due to cardiovascular events. And if we break it down even further, 30% of those cardiovascular events happen when they're completing or after the fire suppression task, so when they're on the fire ground. And then to talk about injuries as well, about 17%, or for every cardiovascular death, there's also 17 cardiovascular events that are non-lethal that occur. So it's a pretty significant issue within the fire service. And also it has been studied when we're looking at the time spent on fire suppression tasks versus non-fire suppression tasks. There could be 12 to 136 times higher risk of sustaining a cardiovascular injury in fire suppression duties compared to any time outside of that time. So I know the range is pretty big. It was just three different populations. This was looked at. There's a smaller municipality and then a national average, and then there's a big metropolitan area, and they gave kind of different relative risks, but the main thing is that the risk goes significantly higher when they're on the fire ground. So this is just another graph to illustrate the times when a fatal injury was caused. This is pretty consistent with other years. This was just 2016, but we can see due to stress or overexertion, which encompasses or includes cardiovascular events and also strokes, significantly more deaths occurred because of that reason than anything else. And strokes, only amount that were included in that 43, there were 40, actually only 4 occurred due to strokes. The other ones were due to cardiovascular disease. And another thing that doesn't show here, that 22 of these deaths are something called homeland heroes, or hometown heroes, which is something that means that the injury didn't occur actually on the fire ground. It happened within 24 hours after the event. So these guys, the firefighters, are not necessarily dying on site. They complete all their tasks, but then 4 hours later, they go home, they go back to the station, and then they have a heart attack there, and they end up dying. So there's something going on also during the recovery process. So why does it happen? Because of fire suppression, there's multiple different stressors that are imposed during these fireground tasks. So there's high sympathetic nervous system activation, also lower parasympathetic activation because they work hand in hand, because of psychological stressors and also the physical strenuousness of the task. There's increased muscular work, very strenuous muscular work, because they have to do all sorts of things on the fire ground, and that also increases the demand from the cardiovascular system. And then there's also the thermal and different toxins that are on the fire ground that also add to the stress. So it's not just the physical component, but it's also the psychological and environmental. But they do lead to different cardiovascular events. I'm not gonna walk through all of these things that occur, but eventually they can lead to arrhythmias and plaque rupture or thrombus formation, and then ultimately sudden cardiac event. Big thing to think about here is it's not only those stressors that I showed on that previous model, but it's also the internal factors of the firefighter. So even when those stressors are all placed, but the person is fit, doesn't have any cardiovascular disease or risks, they're able to, most of the time, they're able to withstand those stressors and they can cope with it. But once we start inducing overweight, low fitness, cardiovascular risk factors into that equation, then those combined triggers lead to complications. And then especially if there's any, disease underlying, there's an even greater risk into getting into the arrhythmias, plaque ruptures, and sudden cardiac events. So it's good to be fit. It's good to not have these underlying factors. It's good to know that our firefighters don't have them when they're going into the fire ground, so that they can be safe even with those imposed stressors. Another thing to draw up is we're only looking at really the physical aspect of the fire ground task, is the relative risk of cardiovascular events during vigorous physical activity, which essentially the fire ground tasks are. We can see here, this is just in general population, but two different studies showed that when physical activity frequency is increased just from 0 to 1 to 2, there's a very significant decrease in relative risk in sudden cardiac or myocardial infarction or sudden cardiac death. So as when the individuals are engaging in physical activity, are doing it in more controlled environments, the risk goes down significantly. And then when we're thinking about the recovery, yes sir?
Is that physical activity cardiovascular or just any physical activity?
I think it was defined as physical activity with more cardiovascular. I would assume most of them were. I would have to look into it, but that's what I think it was. It was a while when I made this, so I can look into it. But I would assume it's mainly cardiovascular. I'll have to check. So when we're thinking about the hometown heroes, the people who are dying after the fire ground task, it would be good to look at also the recovery of the cardiovascular system and all the other systems when they're going through, after they have completed all their duties. So one non-invasive way to maybe measure this would be heart rate recovery and heart rate variability. So both measures have been used to indicate parasympathetic activity, and both of these parameters have been related into greater risk of developing a cardiovascular disease, or after the fact cardiovascular event has happened, both of these parameters have been affected. And then heart rate variability itself has been used as a global indicator of homeostasis, so the current level of stress that the individual is experiencing. And then both of these parameters have also been shown to improve with physical training and to be associated with greater endurance performance. Heart rate variability has not been tested before in firefighters, especially after physical activity. Heart rate recovery has. This is one of the few studies where fitness was, or physical training was measured with that or put into the equation. So we can see from week 1 to week 8, there was a significant decrease or improvement in heart rate recovery in firefighter recruits when they were going through physical training. So far, what we know is fitness characteristics are related to fireground performance and they can be improved with training. Firefighting is physically strenuous and may in part explain the greater risk of cardiovascular events. And then physical training and fitness may attenuate exertion-related cardiovascular events. What's missing from our knowledge so far is how fitness and physical training may affect stress due to firefighting. So can those stressors be attenuated with people who are more fit? Or do those internal markers go down? Do they indicate less stress on those individuals? And also, when individuals go through physical training, can those also be attenuated with that? So how physical fitness and training affects recovery, or never mind, I spoke a little bit differently. So how physical fitness and training affects recovery from firefighting. So are those stressors still in place on people who have greater fitness or go through physical training? So can we see an attenuated stress response after the fireground tasks? So the purpose and aims of the study, the main purpose is to evaluate the effects of fitness and physical training on heart rate dynamics and markers of stress relating to simulated fireground tasks. The first objective is to cross-sectionally evaluate the relationship of the different stress markers and compare them against fitness measures in firefighter recruits. And then the second objective is to look at longitudinal effects of physical training on these different stress markers in firefighter recruits. And then the last objective is to evaluate the relationship of improvements or changes in physical fitness markers and these stress markers that the recruits go through after the simulated fireground test. So going through methods, who we're recruiting are Lexington Firefighter Academy recruits who are participating in their program to become career firefighters. Their ages, we're restricting it to 18 to 40 years of age. Most likely are going to be on the lower end of that. They should not have any medical conditions and no medication affecting heart rate or blood pressure, and they should already have completed a physical exam before they actually enter the academy. So briefly, we'll be testing them on a fixed pace simulated fireground test. So everyone's going to go through the same thing at the same pace, so the intensity that they're going to be able to put in is going to be internally different because everyone's going at the same pace. We're going to measure different markers of stress and recovery, such as heart rate, rating of perceived exertion, blood lactate, heart rate variability, blood pressure, and then also the heart rate recovery is part of the recovery process. And then the subjects will be retested after 10 weeks of physical training. And then those measurements will be evaluated against cardiovascular endurance and percent body fat. And then that's going to happen before and after the physical training. So this is a pretty simple illustration of what we're going through. I had to adjust some of those just before so it looks weird now. But essentially 4 sessions, 2 of those are exactly identical. 1 for baseline measurements, and then one session with the simulated fireground test, then we wait 10 weeks, and then we'll do those both again and see what changes. So included in the baseline and then post-training measurements are height, body mass, body composition, blood pressure, and then we'll get a baseline measurement of the heart rate variability, so we can see if it's any different in the pre-simulated fireground test when they go through it. And then the fireground test, it has 7 different tasks: a stair ascent and descent, post drag, equipment carry, ladder raise and lowering, forcible entry, the search task, and then victim rescue. It's been previously developed for our researchers here and had a high interclass correlation, so it was highly repeatable. Then the average time was 330 seconds. So what we're doing with this study is we're establishing a pace that's 2 standard deviations slower than that, because that should include 95% of the participants should be able to maintain that pace. We'll still, if they are not able to complete that pace, we'll still keep them on. It's just another added factor. Previously, it resulted in a rating of perceived exertion of about 6, mean heart rate of about 85 to 90. Those should be quite different between individuals now, because the pace is going to be the same, and that's going to be determined how fit that individual is, or when they go through the training, that should also change. And the firefighters will wear their personal protective equipment, so everything they're wearing when they're going into a burning building, except for the gas mask, they're not going to be going to air, because these recruits have not been accustomed to the mask at that point. So what we'll measure is heart rate during. This is actually data when I ran it, and I did it at some maximal pace. So the heart rate can vary quite a bit during each activity. So what the arrow shows is the end of each task. When we run it at a maximal pace, the heart rate pretty much climbed up and then stayed up between that 85 and 90%. But it can be quite a bit different when that task is not maximal. So other measurements we'll take is, like I said, rating of perceived exertion, blood lactate, blood pressure. I kind of wanted to just put in some values that was shown before. So this was from Dr. Lesniak's study. These values are just run at PT close, so they're a little bit less than the actual mean values. But the blood lactate climbed up pretty high. Again, this would be representative of someone who is running it at a maximal pace, who will perceive that task as maximal with the pace that we set. So again, it will fluctuate. This is one of the only studies where I had a graph at least for when blood pressure was measured, but what we were expecting to see is this is systolic pressure there, and then diastolic. It should line a little bit right after the activity we'll be measuring. So we'll measure pre and post and see what happens. Heart rate recovery, we'll measure. It's pretty simple measure. This is the end of the task, and then this is just 30 seconds after the task. So when they finish the task, then we'll have them seated, and then heart rate will start slowly decreasing, and then we'll get a difference between the 30 seconds and end of task heart rate. Heart rate variability, what happens during physical activity or exercise. In rest here, we can see that the variability is quite large, and this is when the central nervous system is more sensitive to small changes in the variable receptors. For example, in the lungs, when the lung volume expands, it collapses, it creates pressure. Central nervous system senses that, and then there's very brief changes that happen in heart rate. But once exercise is induced into the equation, then that sensitivity starts going down, because there's a greater stressor that the central nervous system, cardiovascular system has to deal with, so the heart rate variability starts going down. Now, after the activity, kind of reverse happens. So once the heart rate starts going down, variability starts slowly increasing until it's level. Then we can see heart rate isn't really exactly the same, but heart rate variability starts going up again. And this is dependent on the intensity, internal intensity that the individual is going through. So that's why we can measure differences between people in this as well. When they perceive the exercise that's more strenuous, their sympathetic nervous system is turned up more, parasympathetic system is more attenuated. When it's less, then the other thing is the reverse of that. So what we'll measure it with is omega wave equipment, and they give various parameters for heart rate variability. We'll just look at standard deviation of normal to normal heart rate interval differences, and it's essentially an indicator of the overall influence that the autonomic nervous system has on cardiac rhythm. And then the more important one that I'm interested in is the RMSD, or root mean squared standard deviation, which is more, it has been shown to be more related to the parasympathetic nervous system. Unfortunately, there isn't really a parameter that can distinguish the sympathetic nervous system from heart rate variability, but we can make some assumptions of the overall control based off these parameters. So we can see this is in resting condition. Both of these variables are much higher than they are at post-exercise conditions, which means there's a greater stress placed, and there's less sensitivity of the cardiac rhythm. So the main comparisons we'll do is we'll evaluate the relationships of heart rate indices versus the 1.5 mile run and body fat percentage, and then we'll evaluate the changes in those same indices before and after physical training. So the statistical analysis, what we'll do is we'll compare all the other markers as well with the t-test before and after physical training, and then we'll run a multiple linear regression analysis on those same markers, but now this will be again against 1.5 mile run and relative body fat, which would be the independent predictors. And then we'll also look at the change scores that happen before and after training, and then we'll compare that to the change scores of the independent variables. So essentially comparing two different change scores in a multiple linear regression. So I'll run pretty quick. So I'd like to thank my dissertation committee, Dr. Abel, Dr. Clasey, Dr. Bollinger, and Dr. Monk for being on my committee first of all, and then helping me out and with their various expertise and getting my project going. And then also, absolutely, the Lexington Fire Academy, they're huge. Without them, we couldn't do this research at all. They're providing us with facilities to conduct research and also giving access to the recruits. If it wasn't for them, there wasn't really any subjects or anywhere to test this stuff. So I'll be a whole lot different study then. Here's my references. I'll have to go through any gaps later as well. If you have any questions, let me know.
Questions?
Yes, sir.
Do you have a way of keeping them on that pace
Yeah.
through the study?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and then it will be more of an issue at one point than the other. But what essentially our plan is to do is to find out the pace that it takes to keep each task is essentially broken down into different times, and then what we'll have to do is go through each one of those tasks and see how long it takes to essentially walk through it, and then we'll just have to keep that pace, and then that pacer needs to be there when the firefighters are going through the task and show them, this is what you need to keep up. We did some pilot testing with that, and it was just with me, and I had a pacer, and it actually worked pretty well. The the thing with that was that I had run it like 4 times before at least, so I kind of knew what each task was about. So, oh yeah, that's one thing we have to be really careful of. Good question. Yes.
Then there be any advantages or disadvantages to doing this study with career firefighters who have kind of been in it for a while and have been through the physical training, as opposed to cadets who are just now trained and just learning to be firefighters? Like, do you think the cadets would be a sufficient representation of like natural firefighting population?
Right, yeah, so that's definitely a limitation, that these recruits, they might not have done some of these tasks as many times. So the other thing is, once they go through the academy, they could improve in just a task, and then it would make their efficiency better in the task. So that's another limitation we just have to go through. But why we chose the recruits was because they will go through physical training. They have to go through it, so it's easy to get pre-post measures from them. If we were to try to recruit the same number of firefighters and then tell them, you're going to go through this structured workout plan, the retention of those subjects would be a lot less. And we've had plenty of people who have run it with our own pilot testing, and they don't seem to have too many issues with the tasks themselves, because most of them are physical tasks that people may have gone through, or at least in similar ways gone through in their own activities. So it can definitely affect, but I don't see it being as so major that we can obtain reliable results with this. But a good thing would be to maybe measure this with incumbent firefighters who have the same fitness level, and see if their perceived or their internal stress is the same with that pace. That would be a way to measure it. But just that's what we're going with. Yes, sir.
So, I think usually whenever we do anything with a simulated fireground test, we're usually looking at time to completion. And so you're kind of going in a novel route and setting a pace that everyone has to stay. It's much slower than what a lot of them will probably be doing. Are you having them still do like a familiarization period with the simulated fireground test, even though they're going to be going slower than maximal speed?
So we're looking into the possibility of doing this, but what we're afraid of is losing that training effect. Is when they're entering the academy, then we're giving about 45 minutes per day to obtain these measurements. It takes about probably 10-15 minutes to get through one person, and overall when all the pre-testing and post-testing is done. So just to get, I didn't have a subject number, but we're looking at getting about 25 to 30 subjects here. So it takes, just to get through them once, takes about 2 weeks to do. So if we were to add another familiarization period to it, then we were looking to having 4 weeks of testing. So we would be afraid if we were losing that training effect, or they're already getting trained, so there's reduced effect later on.
Have you thought about what's going to happen if any of your test subjects become injured and then knocked out for a couple of weeks from training or anything like that?
If any injuries occur, I don't think we'll keep them on anymore. We did have Ashley's study had a couple injuries, right, and they were knocked out of the study. And usually
associated with the study.
There's
I think one dropped out of
right.
24.
So they just actually the training officer just ended up pulling them out then. So the task itself should be pretty low risk. There has never been any injuries when individuals have run through them, but they're going through the training and stuff can happen during then. But that's a good point. If they have an injury, they're knocked out for 3 weeks, they won't be training, then you wouldn't see that training effect to the same extent. Or if they come in and go injured, into the fireground test, then, you know, that could definitely affect it, so we'll